Hello, and welcome to Unity Church on the Mountain from my home. The title of the talk today is Holy Breath. But before we begin the talk, let's start by affirming together our opening statement. There is only one presence and one power in my life and the universe, God. Take a breath comfortably deep down into the solar plexus, breathing in from the nose, holding it lightly from the diaphragm, not cutting it off with the tongue, and exhale through the mouth. This is one way I like to call the holy breath. So breathing in through the nose, and releasing. It's a good way to start a prayer, to start a time of sharing the presence of Spirit with yourself. So one more holy breath. Let us affirm together the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Leave us not in temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen. So now, share this small meditation with me. Begin by placing your hand over your heart. Breathing normally. You may close your eyes if it feels better. Closing your eyes helps you go inside. And begin to become more aware of your breath without changing your breathing pattern or controlling it. Just breathing in and out. Move your awareness to your heart space, leaving behind that which is of the brain mind and moving to heart mind. Our awareness becomes greater. We are aware of thoughts and we let them pass. As we bring our awareness to our breath, continuing to allow it to just pass in and out normally. Become aware of that rhythm, aware of the depth of the breath. As you relax, notice how the breathing becomes a little deeper, maybe a little slower, naturally, without effort. So just becoming aware of this breath. Feeling gratitude. Thankful, not for any one thing, only grateful. We say thank you, and so it is, Amen. So there we have an introduction to holy breath. But what else can be said? I want to start the talk by sharing with you a scripture. I'm going to share from the King James Version from my childhood Bible. And the scripture is in the Gospel of John, chapter 4, verse 24. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. On the surface, that seems like somewhat of a simple verse, and yet it does leave itself open to interpretation. That very first line, God is a spirit. The King James is not my favorite translation of the Bible, but it is one that's very common. It's probably the most printed book ever in the history of books. There's that first line, God is a spirit. When we look to the Greek, we see a word for spirit that can be translated as both spirit and breath. It has feminine gender. Going deeper back to the original language that Jesus spoke, there is an Aramaic word for spirit, ruah. Ruah. And like many Aramaic words, this word can have various meanings in the English language. Yes, it can be translated as spirit, but it can also be translated as wind, air, and breath. If we take this word and remember that sacred unity that is the translation of from a womb, from our Father. And we take this breath that is, see that breath. If our Father, no, if God is spirit, if God is a breath, God, remember in Aramaic from last week, is Allah, which is this sacred unity. And if there is this sacred unity is a breath, then as we breathe, you see, we participate in this sacred unity. It's not only the air that goes in, but we are connected through this air, through this breath, with all of the air that's in the atmosphere, with all of the air that is in this unity, this sacred unity in whom we live and move and have our being. This breath, it participates in the wind. You see how it multiplies as we consider the depths of all of the meanings of this word, ruah, that translates in the King James as spirit. I've been reading Neil Douglas Klotz, because he's just really fascinating in how he can take the Aramaic and expand through his contemplation on these words and go so much deeper than can be done in a direct translation. I mean, even, okay, let's take for example this verse from John and look in the Lamsa translation from the Aramaic. Because even Lamsa, I don't think he tries to bring in that depth that we get from Neil Douglas Klotz. And I'll share his translation of this verse in just a little while. And here's what Lamsa says for this same verse. And remember, Lamsa is translating directly from the Aramaic. For God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. So it's very similar to what we get in King James without the article a spirit. God is spirit. That brings that sacred unity more into that verse. But it doesn't really expand on all the possible subtle meanings in that word that he's translating as spirit. So if we go on, we've got that idea of worshiping him in spirit. Worshiping him. So what is this Aramaic idea that comes from the word that's translated as worship? And this word also has more than one meaning. It's like bowing oneself. That idea of not my will, but thy will. And the other meaning is surrender. So bowing oneself, bowing my small self to the larger self that is spirit. Surrendering to spirit. So it's a different idea of what probably comes to mind when we hear that word worship. Worship him in spirit. We've already talked about spirit. This breath, this idea of breathing in this connected way. And then the word truth. Truth. It's a word that's very important to unity and what unity teaches. Sometimes we call ourselves seekers of truth. So what is this Aramaic word about that has been translated very simply as truth? One of the possible meanings for that word in Aramaic is that which liberates and opens possibilities. Interesting. We don't normally think of truth that way. But if you really look, the truth will set you free. We can see that idea of that which liberates. That which is strong and vigorous. Truth. That which acts in keeping with universal harmony. Doesn't that sound like truth? Like, think about the book by Eric Butterworth, that's called In the Flow. In the flow, in keeping with the universal harmony. It is also a sense of right direction in this particular moment. Truth. That sense that I am on the path of spirit right now. So let's look at Neil Douglas Klotz as he translates that very simple verse that we heard in King James. I'm going to say the King James Version one more time. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. All right, keeping that in mind, let's look at the depth when we consider the myriad of meaning that can come from the original Aramaic. God is breath. All that breathes resides in the only being. From my breath to the air, we share the wind that blows around the planet. Sacred unity inspires all. Inspires. Those who surrender to unity, bowing to it in utmost adoration, must do so in breath and harmony, like the sense of right direction that derives from the universal winds. I'm going to say it one more time. God is breath. All that breathes resides in the only being. From my breath to the air we share, to the wind that blows around the planet, sacred unity inspires all. Those who surrender to unity, bowing to it in utmost adoration, must do so in breath and harmony, like the sense of right direction that drives the universal winds. So breathing. It's something we can't help but to do. We breathe. As long as we're alive in this body, we breathe. But there are subtle differences in our breath. When, in the Jewish tradition, they look at letters. Remember we talked about that briefly last week. The letters that make up words are as important for the meaning as the word itself. This is something we don't really get so much in the English language. And for a Hebrew at the time of Jesus, and even today, the letter H, there are four different letters in the Hebrew alphabet, or in the Aramaic alphabet, because in Hebrew and Aramaic the alphabet is the same. The characters look different, but the names for the characters are the same. So remember that Aramaic word, ruah. It even sounds like a breath. And then, so in the alphabet, in Aramaic and Hebrew, there are 4 letters that have this H sound, similar to H. And each one of them is a way of expressing a type of breath. They begin with the most pure H sound that we hear in ruah. That is really just this breath. Whenever they teach us to sing and in voice coaching and voice lessons, we're taught not really to pronounce that H. It's sort of it's just really a breathing. It's really not pronounced. That consonant follows the vowel sounds. It's very pure, very nice sounding. And that is the letter Hey, the Aramaic letter Hey. And this breath is free and unencumbered, like holy breath. Holy breath. Okay. There's another letter, Heth. It's pronounced like the CH sound in the Scottish loch. So loch. a little bit more harsh, a little bit more, a little bit more of the glottal sound. And it refers to the breath as it begins to enter the body and enliven it. So the subtlety of that pure breath is not quite there with this sound. Progressing, we come to kaf, which is a ch, like there's not really in English, but it's a Germanic type of an H that's like in Bach, the composer, J.S. Bach. And it is a fully embodied breath. It's much more associated with body as opposed to spirit. And then finally there's this eh. It's also not really an English. This is a sound you don't have much in English, and certainly not a letter. We can come close with the word they. There's that E sound in they, a, but without the Y in they. So the, more of an eh. This sound is what begins the Aramaic letter for enemy. Remember, enemy gets translated as Satan. And this is a breath that is closed off. It's overly involved in the body. It's trapped. It's not a deep breath. It's not an... It is eh. It's very shallow. So why talk so much about the breath? Let's go back to that verse that talks about this idea of surrendering in spirit and truth, surrendering in breath and harmony. So I want to read Neil Douglas Klotz's one more time, and then we have an exercise that I would like to introduce. God is breath. All that breathes resides in the only being. From my breath to the air we share, to the wind that blows around the planet, sacred unity inspires all. Those who surrender to unity, bowing to it in utmost adoration, must do so in breath and harmony, like the sense of right direction that drives the universal winds. So there's this idea that through our breath and the type of breath that we have as we breathe, because we're going to breathe, that we can share in this unity, or we can close ourselves off in separation in the breath. So let's look at this exercise. We've already talked about what I'm calling holy breath, and then breathing in through the nose deeply, holding it for a short time without shutting it off here in the glottal area, breathing it in and down, and holding it from the diaphragm, and then releasing through the mouth. So we have this exercise. It's something that we probably do instinctively when we feel tension in our body. And certainly it's how I like to introduce spirit breaks. It's how I begin my daily spiritual practice, my daily devotionals, my prayer time, that time that I give in the morning to spirit. This idea of the holy breath, it cleanses my consciousness and brings me to center. When I find myself out of center through the day, take a spirit break, this holy breath helps to bring my consciousness back to center where I can affirm truth. Or begin a practice like the welcoming practice and then following the line. Or just this centering that comes from the idea of centering prayer. Or affirmations and denials the denial, leaving room so that I can take that holy breath and then express in that space the affirmation of truth. But that's really not the exercise that I want to introduce today. There's this idea of breath and bringing us in unity with body and in unity through this spirit and body with all of nature. Remember, God's Spirit is in whom we live and move and have our being. The idea that we partake in this breath as one. So this is something that I began doing without even realizing it. When I was in the Army, we did a lot of physical training. We did a lot of running. We did exercises. And we did it, a lot of exercising together. We called it in cadence. So we were singing while we were moving so that we would be able to move as a unit. All of the participants in the physical training, we were all together. We were in step. We were in cadence. And the singing was the rhythm that brings the cadence of the body. And as we sing, there's this inspiration and respiration. So you have this natural flow. And we were also required on a regular basis to take a physical training test, and where we would be timed in how fast we could run 2 miles. This was something that you did independently as one. And so here's in doing this 2-mile run and in practicing getting ready for it, I found myself following this cadence and synchronizing my breath with my feet. So that, I was basically counting my steps through the breathing. And each person and the pace of your steps is going to affect how they link together. But if we become aware of our body and at the same time become aware of our breathing, they follow into this rhythm pattern. I don't think it has to be forced. I think that it will just happen on its own. Because remember, when I was doing it there in the Army, I had no idea of the spiritual meaning of what it was that I was doing. But I know it helped me get through that 2 miles. And we were always pushing ourselves, to the limit, of physical limit, because we wanted a good time. And anyway, so enough on that. So there's this idea of taking a walk or a run, whichever is comfortable for you. But I do ask you sometime during the week to take the opportunity to become aware of your breathing in relation to your steps. And just notice what this is like. It's just really an observation. But these observations help us become in the flow. Don't take my word, try it. Okay? And from us, when we get in that flow, remember that universal harmony of being in that universal wind, that universal flow from that verse. We are worshiping in spirit and truth, if we go back to the King James. So we are radiating peace, a peace of God in this exercise. So on that note, I want to sing a song that's called, I call it Lesson 188. It's written by James Francis Twyman. I'm not sure exactly. He may call it the Peace of God, but it comes from A Course in Miracles, Lesson 188. And he took some words from that lesson and set them to music. It's just really beautiful. It really reminds me of that rhythm of the breath and that resonance that we get when we get in that harmony, in that flow. Like Eric Butterworth would say, in the flow of life. So just taking that breath and allowing the words to flow, the vibration. And isn't that what breath is? A vibration. The peace of God shining in me now. The peace of God shining in me now. The peace of God shining in me now. The peace of God is shining in me now. The peace of God 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 is shining in me now. The peace of God 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 is shining in me now. 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 The peace of God 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 is shining in me now. So, as I was doing my walks, because I walk more often than I run now, I would find that a song might enter into my head, because it's easier for me to synchronize my breathing and my walking steps with song. And this song lends itself very nicely to synchronizing the breath and the body, moving from mind to heart, radiating from that realized soul. As we close the talk today, let's affirm together the prayer for protection. The light of God surrounds us. I am the light. The love of God enfolds us. I am the love. The power of God protects us. I am the power. The presence of God watches over us. I am the presence. Wherever I am, God is, and all is well. Thank you.